Perfect. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the panel Policy, Climate, and COVID. My name is Ashley Torres. I'm gonna be your moderator for tonight's panel. So I will ask if the speakers, you guys could mute your microphone and then unmute it when you want to have. Yes, that's why we don't create that much noise. Perfect. So I'm really excited to be here tonight with all of these great panelists that we have lined up for you. So before we start, I would just like to start off with a land acknowledgement. So we would like to acknowledge that this space is located on unceded indigenous land. The Ganin-Gehaga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the land and the water in which we gather today. Geauga is historically known as gathering place for many First Nations who are still living and thriving today. Today, it is home of a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We acknowledge that we are located on a land that has been the site of human creativity and storytelling for thousands of years, and are thankful that we are able to create, collaborate, and play and work here. In our quest to support sustainable futures, we think it's important to acknowledge the historical realities of inequality that our society is built upon. The CSU, ASFA, and CUPERG, and Sustainable Concordia aspire to be an ally in the ongoing process of settling our current and future communities. Now, for our panelists that we have tonight, first off, we have Ellen Gabriel. Ellen Gabriel is a Ghanaian Gehaga human rights and environmental rights activist and artist of Turtlecan from Gantasage, Ghanaian Gehaga territory. Ellen has become well known in the public when she was chosen by the people of the Longhouse and her community of Gantasage to be their spokesperson during the 1990 Gantasage siege, so-called Oka crisis. Since 1990, she has been a human rights and advocate for the collective and individual rights of Indigenous people, and she has worked diligently to sensitize the public, academics, policing authorities, and politicians on the history, culture, and identity of Indigenous people. She holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts from Concordia University, and she has received numerous awards and distinctions from her advocacy work. Next off, we have also Sandy Hudson with us tonight. Sandy is a Toronto-based organizer, communication specialist, political strategist, public intellectual, writer, and abolitionist activist. She's the co-founder of Black Lives Matter movement in Canada and Black Lives Matter Montreal. She has also co-founded the Black Liberation Collective Canada, the campus-based extension of the movement. The work that she has done she has accomplished with her team is really incredible, and her efforts to publicly address anti-racism have resulted in concrete policy change. And lastly, we have Harsha William with us tonight, who is a migrant rights activist and lawyer based in BC. She has been organizing in migrant justice, anti-capitalist, feminist, abolitionist, and anti-imperialist movements for the past 2 decades on unceded Coast Salish territory. She has been involved in grassroots movements, including No One is Illegal on the February 14 Women's March Memorial, and her advocacy alongside comrades and community has resulted in significant transformation in policies relating to immigration detention, women's equality, Indigenous land rights, policing practices, and social assistance regulations. She's also the award-winning author of The Ongoing Border Imperialism, co-author of The Never Home, Legislating Discrimination in Canada Immigration, as well as Red Woman Rising, Indigenous Women Survivors in Vancouver Downtown East Side. Trained in law, Harsha is the new executive director of BC Liberties Association. She wants a world without borders, bitums, bombs, and bros. So most of you listening to today's stream are very well known or you guys are very aware of like who these speakers are today, or I hope so. So first off, I would like to just briefly talk about what really pushed you guys to really be involved in these. And like, I know for starters, Ellen, you were really chosen by your community, and that's how you got initially started all of this activism. But what has really pushed you to continue and really keep getting so much involved and keep going on this fight? So if you could start. Ellen, you can go ahead. You can just unmute yourself. Okay, then we can start maybe with Sandy, if you'd like to share what really prompts you to start. Oh, Ellen, can you hear me now?
I don't have a great internet where I am, so can you
Yeah,
hear me
sure,
now?
we can hear you.
Okay. For Indigenous people, it's not a hobby. It's what we have to do because we're fighting colonization and growing up in this community, going to a non-Indigenous school, not being able to have my language education in my language. It's part of who we are. It's not something that we do on the side or that we quit when we're tired. This is a constant thing. It's multi-generational, and it's not something that is taken lightly. I mean, my work started before 1990, but I just happened to be chosen at that time. I think that for me, what I can't stand are bullies, and that's what the Canadian government is. They're a bunch of bullies, and they work with corporations. They're corrupt. This whole system is corrupt. And so when I think about what we're going to do 7 generations from now, then I think that it's irresponsible for me to say, well, I'm tired now. I'm going to take a rest, and um, for sure I'm entitled to a break. But colonization doesn't rest. Um, and so, some way we have to take care of ourselves, but also continue the fight because it's far from over. In spite of many speeches about reconciliation, which has never happened, in spite of the fact that there's been tons of reports from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples to today, where we saw the missing and murdered Indigenous women report. It never rests. So until it does, I guess I'll just continue. Whether I'm in my rocking chair watching the young people take over, or writing a book. So, thanks.
Thank you for sharing that. And Sandy, what about you? What really, I know it was sparked back in 2016 when this whole thing, but I know you've been also very involved in the student movements. So you can share a bit what has been a little bit your journey and what has really giving you the strength to keep doing this.
And start off by saying that I'm coming to you all from Toronto, which has been recognized as Los Angeles. It's unceded territory of Tongva people. And I'm here because this is where I go to school. A quick correction: I did not found Montreal, but I love the people. They're wonderful folks. I want to make sure that know that was in Toronto and did work with BLM. Off actually in 2014, and that as a result of a conversation that I had with my mother, we're really just incensed, heartbroken over the highly publicized. Can everybody hear me? Some notes that things are choppy. The mic is not working. Okay.
Yeah, your mic is kind of breaking up. Perhaps we can continue with Harsha.
I will fix this.
For sure. And sorry for the mistake for BLM. I'm in BLM Canada and automatically say Montreal. Very sorry. And so for Harsha, could you give us a little bit of brief of what that journey looked like for you?
Sure, thank you. I will be brief. I'm here right now in unceded Coast Salish territories. Thank you for having me. And thank you everyone for joining in, and truly just such an honor to be here with Ellen and Sandy and everyone. I'm on unceded Coast Salish territories, which are the sovereign unceded lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people, and have lived here now for approximately 15 years. And, I'll speak a little bit about my journey, but I would really be remiss because Ellen is here to not just mention how much of an influence Ellen was for me and continues to be for me when I lived in Kanien'kehá:ka territories, and just had the huge honor and privilege of learning from her and being guided and mentored by her and her patience and her wisdom. So just a huge part of my journey involved Ellen. And so I just want to express my gratitude and raise my hands to you, Ellen, for all the work you've done for so long, and continue to do for your nation, and really just for so many of us through your guidance and your mentorship. So I think I'll keep it brief, because our journeys are always multifold. There's never a particular moment per se. I'd say part of it is certainly familial. I come from a family that was impacted by the partition, which is one of the largest mass displacements in human history, and also specifically the partition of Punjab that led to a continuous and ongoing decimation of the region, which then led to what was known as a green revolution, which was not green at all, just mass industrial agriculture brought into the region that affected peasants and farmers, and then the ongoing genocide of Sikhs, which culminated in particularly the 1980s in a massive counterinsurgency that killed 6 people every single minute in a given year. And so there's particularly for this is distinct. We all have different histories. I'm not suggesting that they can be flattened or equated, but I think for most people involved in the movement, there's always something that we're aware of that is part of our familial histories, that are part of our personal histories. And then I think the task is, how to take that which is personal and expand our understanding and our willingness to really just stand up for everybody in a way, right? Like, how do I take what is something that I've been impacted by and see that is different but connected to the struggles of so many other people? So for me, that really has been part of that. When I came to Canada, I came here with various immigration statuses over time, was very briefly incarcerated in a migrant detention center, which is very distinct from those who face long-term detention or incarceration, but gave me again a glimpse into what that system is through my experience. But really, I'd say most of what I've learned has been just through other people, and being, just having the gift of hearing people speak, people who've been able and willing to share their experiences, to refuse to turn away, to learn from the BLM movement that Sandy's part of and many others are part of, to listen to folks who are undocumented. And also, I think a commitment. It can be very easy sometimes to also forget the global scope, because there's so much that's happening in our communities, in our backyard. So I think for me, part of my journey has also been just an immense amount of learning and continued learning about what's happening in the world. We share this planet, not only in the sense of climate change, which is very real, that makes it obvious that we only have one planet, but also the devastation, the exploitation, the genocide, the extraction, the killings, the murders that are happening around this world, and which Canada is very much implicated in. When we talk about standing up against capitalism, when we talk about standing up for Indigenous and Black lives, when we talk about standing up against, carceral institutions, for me, that very much extends into the international, about how is Canadian imperialism impacting and implicated, how are Canadian mining companies implicated. So part of that has also been, listening to voices around the world, and very much wanting to be responsible and accountable to communities all around the world. So that's really been part of my journey, ongoing, as I'm sure for many of us. So thank you for the opportunity to share that.
Thank you for sharing that, for sure. And now maybe Sandy, you can share a bit of your journey as well.
I hope this is better. Can you all hear me? Great. Yeah, sure. I can share my journey. You asked me a little bit about my student union experience. Yes, I was a student activist as well, and perhaps still am, since I am a student again. When I started school, I was the first in my family to attend post-secondary education, and didn't have it all figured out, didn't know what some of the rules were, and actually didn't really know how I was going to afford it. I worked really hard in high school to try to get scholarships, but I also needed to work 3 jobs in my first year, just because of where I was financially. And I ended up losing all my scholarships, a lot of sleep, and wasn't able to afford the second year of the program that I had chosen. So where I went to school, the University of Toronto, in your second year, if you're in computer science, which is what I was in, your fees jump by like 100%. It's like double what it was. And I didn't realize that. And I all of a sudden was priced out of my program, and went to the student union to see if there was like any sort of emergency funds that I could get. And they didn't have any, but they were planning a rally. And so that was my first sort of experience going to a rally. And when I was there, I just realized, wow, like look at all of these people. Thousands of people have come out to try to change this policy. I wonder if it's going to be effective. And right afterwards, the government in Ontario announced a tuition fee freeze. And I just thought I would really love to learn how to take these skills of creating public demonstrations, public unrest, in order to force a political change at a policy level, and even beyond, cultural change on how people even think about particular societal issues. And so that was just my first foray into organizing. And I really, really did a lot of organizing around anti-racism work, anti-Black racism work, decolonization work on my campus, and continue to do that once I left. And in 2014, my brother and I were having a conversation after being so incensed and also heartbroken at the killings, the murders of Michael Brown in Ferguson, and of Jermaine Carby in Brampton, which is a suburb of Toronto. And we were seeing on the news a lot of discussion on Canadian media about Michael Brown and Darren Wilson, who killed him, but not much about Jermaine Carby, and nobody even knew the name of the officer who killed him at the time, Ryan Reed. And so I was upset about it. Many people in the Black community were upset about it. We were waiting to see if somebody was going to organize some sort of protest in Toronto. My brother contacted me and said, have you heard anything? When's the protest happening? And I hadn't. And then he kind of chided me. He was like, look, you have all of these skills. You've been doing this stuff in student organizing for years. What are you waiting for? Maybe you should just do it. And so I contacted a number of Black activists that I knew, and we organized something fairly quickly that we thought maybe 50 people would show up to in front of the U.S. consulate, and about 3,000 people showed up. And it was over 2 days that we had organized it. And so we knew that we had stumbled onto a definite need in the city of Toronto for some sort of mobilization force with respect to the anti-Black racism that we all experience. And that is how that work in Toronto was born. This iteration of the Black liberation movement, because I should say we're very connected to movements that have been happening ever since Black people had been stolen from our lands and taken and brought here.
Thank you very much for sharing that. It's very interesting to see how much all of these battles are so connected with each other, because we have like this common sort of enemy, that's the Canadian state. So in segue to that, 2020 has been seen a massive increase in popular support for BIPOC-led movements such as Black Lives Matter movement, support for traditional Indigenous leadership that we saw in Wet'suwet'en territory, Six Nations, and now in Ganotazage, and as well for permanent status migrant workers. What do you think caused this sudden spike of interest? And do you think that interest is actually there, and do you think it will actually do something? So we can start with Ellen, and then Sandy, and then Harsha.
I don't know. I don't feel like I'm an expert. I feel like I'm learning from Harsha and Sandy on this. So I'll give it my best shot. I don't know. I think it's just been building, and people have time on their hands during the pandemic. We were on lockdown, and then these crazy things were still happening, and so it was able to focus on those issues. Um, but why now in 2020? I think people were. I guess people were ready. I'm like I said, I'm not an expert, but we're in. I'll just speak from where I sit, which is Wet'suwet'en was going on just before the pandemic. People were marching in the streets for the Wet'suwet'en people. Um, Indigenous people have always been trying to gather things together, and I'll concur with Sandy. I stand also on big shoulders with the American Indian movement from the 60s and 70s that aligned with themselves with the Black Panther movement. There was a history there, and I think people have been slowly since I guess 1990 been learning about those movements, and it's just been building up over these decades, and it exploded this year in a different way than the previous explosions because of a pandemic. But I think that people are fed up. They're just fed up. This younger generation is much more in tune with what's going on in the world. We've had a lot of research being done about corrupt systems, about colonization and genocide, and I think people were just ready. They were just ready to go on the streets. And I have to give my respect and love to the Black Lives Matter movement, who were the first ones to actually protest during this pandemic because of the injustice, because of the outrage of what we witnessed, but has been going on for centuries. So I think it's just, I don't want to diminish the movement, but I think that just people had more time to learn about stuff. And then when George Floyd was murdered, it just sparked something, and it's unfortunate that it took someone for us to all as a species witness this cruel and depraved murder that we saw and which went globally. So I think I'll cut it there for now, because I think there's two other experts that you should be listening to. So thanks.
Thank you very much for that. Sandy, you want to join in that?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Ellen said. I think that there's a way that the pandemic has allowed people to focus on particular issues that are, obviously continuing. But I also think there's a underlying critique there about how much we work right now in 2020 in our society. I think that typically, we work so much because of the way that technology works, work has encroached on the time that is supposed to be for ourselves and our families. We work so much that it's hard to be a part of civic engagement, especially if you are working class and maybe you're working more than one job, and several people in your family are working. It's hard to focus on some of the issues that are impacting our society every day. And then all of a sudden the pandemic hits and many people are not working for the first time in a really long time. Now, that's obviously not everybody. Like the essential workers were forced to continue working through very difficult circumstances. But many people, my father included, were all of a sudden not working for the first time in a very long time. And so those people were able to pay attention to what was going on in the news in a way that perhaps they weren't able to before, and to become involved in a way that perhaps they weren't able to before. And that's something that we should think about just generally, about how much work prevents us from shaping our society and recreating and shifting our society in ways that we would like to. Those who are able to afford leisure time or civic engagement time have more power in our society to shape all of these policies because they have that time. And so now all of a sudden summer 2020 hits and more people have the time to engage. And I think that also has a lot to do with it. with respect to your question about whether people truly do care, I do think that people truly do care. I know that there's a nervousness around, being the issue of the moment and people forgetting about it. I don't think that that's what's happened here. I think that what's happened this summer is that there's been so much attention paid to the particular issue of police violence against Black people, police violence against Indigenous people, that we've actually shifted culture significantly through our movement work. And you can't really go back to a place of ignorance once you have gained the knowledge of, oh, well, the police don't do this, or, oh, the police do these things that we didn't know before. Once a society knows those things and has an idea of how something is so unjust, you can't really go back to a society that doesn't know those things. So even if it's not in the news 24 hours, like it was in the first few weeks of June, I think that the change that society has experienced will result in a significant policy change. It may not be now or tomorrow, but Minneapolis has voted to abolish its police department. Oakland has voted to get rid of weapons for all frontline police. Seattle has defunded their police department by 50%. We've seen some changes in Canada as well, with school boards eliminating their relationship to police officers. And so, I think that these kind of changes are going to start rolling out, and eventually we're going to have some really significant policy change. And that happens as a result of culture shifting and orienting differently around a particular issue.
Perfect. So now, Harsha, if you can give us your thoughts about this.
Yeah, briefly. Very much in agreement with what Ellen and Sandy have already said. So, just echoing their points there, particularly about the pandemic, in terms of the relationship to work and leisure, and then simultaneously the relationship to work and unemployment and austerity, right? And so on the one hand, some, people having a lot of time, and also time that people didn't necessarily anticipate, and also then, with bills that people can't pay, right? And that kind of anger that comes in the context of loss of jobs, layoffs, unemployment, lack of access to EI that's robust and makes sense, and, a pittance when it comes to CERB. So that anger at government, right? You're supposed to believe in the government, for those who believe in that kind of myth, who think that the state and the government will take care of them, in particularly a health emergency, right? So of course we know oppressed communities know that you can't rely on the state, but the kind of middle class or even working class white workers who think that they've bought into this idea of the state will protect us suddenly realize, well, shit, why am I paying into the state structure that actually isn't benefiting me, and I have no say. I can't even access income. And so I think that kind of anger, and then simultaneously an anxiety about a health pandemic, and if the state can't take care of my kind of economic needs, can it actually truly take care of these larger questions about the health and well-being of our society? I think those all kind of work together. And I think, to echo what Sandy and Ellen said earlier, this idea of it, I go back and forth personally in terms of this idea of whether movements are getting paid more attention to, because of course we know that no movement is made in a year, right? As we've already heard, we're on the shoulders of giants when it comes to movements, and that each movement is it's a cyclical process. It's an iteration, and it builds off everything we've ever learned before, and we get stronger and stronger. And there's ebbs and flows. And so in some ways, I guess for me, I haven't in the past 20 years known a year where there hasn't been a powerful movement, actually. Like, there's always been movements. Sandy pointed out BLM movements in the current iteration of BLM have been going on since 2016. And, the time BLM stopped Pride, like everything, the Tent City. And, same with Ellen was speaking about with Wet'suwet'en, which is just one of many land defense struggles. And that's been going on with the founding of Unistoten, which was actually 10 years ago. So everything has a much longer life. So in some ways, I'm not actually sure even that 2020 is the year. Like every year has something incredible that inspires us, but I think those are the particular parts of what's happening in COVID that makes people just more aware. And I think even things, hearing Sandy speak about time, I've heard folks even talk about how the fact that things that we were always told by employers that could never happen are suddenly just a fact of life. Like you couldn't do remote work because employers thought that meant, that was just a form of discipline, right? Like being in the office is a form of discipline often. And now suddenly remote work is the norm. People don't have to commute 2 hours a day, right? For a lot of working class people, your commute is 2 hours a day. That's so much time which you are not paid for. And that really was largely a disciplinary measure to ensure that you are in the office and under surveillance if your job included things that you didn't have to do, right, in the workplace. And so it also opens up the space of imagination. In a different example, we've been told for so long that prisons are just a function of life, right? We need prisons. What will we do if we suddenly don't have prisons? What will happen to quote unquote public safety? And then we see, in a very limited way, of course, but we see certain provinces suddenly saying, oh my gosh, of course, the pandemic is a health emergency in prisons. And again, largely coming from movement pressures and abolitionists who've been saying, prisons are a hotspot for the spreading of COVID-19. And so in some provinces, we've seen some minimal measures where, people are being released from prison. So all of a sudden, things that we've been told could never happen. And as Sandy was saying, that space of possibility opens up because now we're like, wait, you always knew this could happen. You always knew that, the earth wouldn't shatter if prisoners were released from prison, because we already know that people who are, even if you're not an abolitionist, even if you're the state government, it is undeniable that most people are on remand. Most people are, are being held pending trial. Most people are being held on nonviolent, quote unquote, nonviolent crimes, like poverty-related crimes, like shoplifting, petty assault, etc. Right? So that space of possibility opens up because suddenly the government can make these things happen. So I think those are perhaps some of the specificities to this kind of pandemic context, but really just so much of movement is built atop of each other. And I think also the last thing is just generally our increasing access to the world, right? We can access what's happening in other parts of the world so quickly that we can be inspired and have solidarity actions, for example, in solidarity with what's happening in really just parts of the world everywhere. And that's also slightly different in terms of our access to what's happening around the world, to be inspired, to share tactics, and to just really just express our solidarity.
Yeah, that's very interesting to really see that a lot of people think sometimes that like it was giving on a spotlight on 2020, but we don't think of like Municipality, the camp was built 10 years ago. Most people don't even know that, and they just saw the blockades and saw everything. And it's really interesting that it's not really talked about so much in the media, or so we just capture like small moments. And it's also very interesting that you guys talk about globalization, or like Harsha, you were speaking on it about I was seeing this morning in my news feed about defunding the police in Colombia, and sort of them being inspired right now with the BLM movement, and uprising really going on right now in my city, in Bogota. So it's just very interesting how it is true that many parts of the world get inspired by so many movements that sometimes we're like not even aware about that. That's interesting. So a bit more on the topic of the spotlight. What do you think it's important when a movement accomplishes that public spotlight, how to utilize it, or how to create more dialogue? Do you think that using that public support, like how do you use that public support effectively while resisting the cooptation and dilution of the cause? Like, how do you think that really, when you have that spotlight and the media talk about, what do you think is the most effective way of going about it? I don't know if that makes sense. Sandy, if you can start, and then we can go around.
Yeah, sure. I do think that there are moments, for whatever reason, all sorts of different variables come together to make the media all of a sudden interested in your particular struggle. And, one thing that's always really important is to stay ready for those moments. 95% of activism is not something you're going to see on television screens because nobody thinks it's interesting to watch people doing a lot of reading, a lot of writing, and a lot of talking to one another and having arguments. That's not very interesting to a lot of people, but that's what happens in the in-between times when the media is not paying attention and they're not interested in us. And so one thing was that we were always staying ready on these issues. When we realized that a lot of people were starting to pay very close attention, and the media was in particular really interested in the issue of anti-Black racism and police violence, in particular with anti-Black racism. A number of us got on a call in the United States and Canada and decided, like, this is the moment for defund the police. The outrage is palpable. We can shift society so that we can start talking about defunding the police. If we do this, kind of coordinatedly, if we're all talking about some of the same arguments and putting it out there, like using this moment as a mass education campaign, really trying to educate as many people as possible around the world en masse about the issue of defunding the police and abolition of police, maybe we can get this to become a popular idea. And we are wildly surprised, but also feel quite good about how effectively we were able to do that. We placed as many op-eds as we could, talking about the difficult arguments that people sometimes shy away from. We just delved into all of them and just said, look, these are rational ideas. These arguments make sense, and we're just going to do what we can to have those arguments in full on the air, and force people to really contend with this. And, all of us were experiencing at the beginning some pushback from traditional media who really were looking for the type of interviews that sound like, "Hi, Sandy. How do you feel about what's happening right now?" And then I would say, "I feel terrible." And they would say, "Don't you think that people need to be against racism?" "Yes." "Do you think racism exists in Canada?" "Oh, well, yeah, I think that people should know about that." "Well, thank you for coming on today, Sandy. Goodbye." Like, that's the type of, discussion, very surface level, very superficial discussion that people wanted to have. But what we wanted people to hear this time around was Black Lives Matter, and so you must defund the police. That was what we wanted to finish a sentence. Do you know what I mean? And so we got on these programs and did these op-eds and did these radio shows and did these, interviews, where when the question came, do you think racism exists? Like, the answer was absolutely. And defunding of the police is one of the ways that we can tackle one of the manifestations of racism. We were really forceful about talking about the specific arguments. And I think that was quite successful. And so, I'd love to hear more from Harsha and Ellen about how they feel about when the media is suddenly paying attention. But we really try to use those moments as mass education campaigns.
Yeah, I'm curious about Ellen. What do you think about that? Because I feel like you had like very different experience back in the 90s, and now, how do you see that different sort of uh, spotlight throughout the years?
Yeah, I mean, for us, the media hijacked our narrative, and they talked about, rather than a grassroots movement, it was easier to say it's a warrior movement and they have weapons and this is what they're willing to do. So it criminalized all of us. And so when one person does something, we're all included in, we're all painted with the same brush. So it's been very frustrating for me. I think the media, there are some good journalists out there, but it's really difficult to educate people when they've been told this story for 3 decades, and there's really not much movement in trying to change that narrative, other than the live interviews, which I like because they can't edit me, but they've never asked me to do an op-ed on the crisis. It's always somebody else who was not involved, or someone with academia who's just a little bit more prolific in having this higher level of vocabulary to address the educated masses, whereas I like to keep it simple so that everyone can understand what I have to say. And I think that the media is, like I said, it's a double-edged sword. I think you need them, and then at the same time you really got to try and be clever and be wise to the kinds of tactics they use to try and get you to say that little 3-second sound bit that they're looking for. It's getting a little bit better, but it's really not. Like CBC did something this past weekend in regards to a house fire. So they talked about, like, it's suspicious, it's arson, they know that for sure. And then they talked about our land issue, sort of, and they tried to imply that we were involved in it somehow, that it's our fault, right? So this is the thing, it's like, for us as Mohawks or Gahaga people, we are public enemy number one. And especially in Quebec, where the premier said there's no racism. There's no racism in Quebec, right? There's also no pandemic, but it's a pandemic, but it's small, right? And I find that we either have to really push hard in academia to help us write our story in a way that reflects our realities, or we're going to have to just keep fighting, because there's such a strong resistance by government, by the education system, to really tell the stories and the realities of Indigenous people and Black and people of color, because it's much easier to see us as the other. It's much easier to see us as this, like, exotic creature or a criminal. You always want something. It's I was walking down the street towards the development site. Actually, I was riding my bike, and I had my Ganassaga tourism office sign on my back as I'm pedaling down the street. And these two little boys, they must have been 7 and 8. They were saying, "Pas d'autochtones ici," no natives here. And they're just little boys, So obviously, racism exists, Premier Legault. It's just, like, it's sad to see that it's still continuing. It's sad to see that, the people who are giving us a bad name were included with what they're doing. And we're trying to create some kind of peaceful coexistence. And this divide and conquer that they use very, very, very smoothly, the media and the government, is like, well, here's the elected council. And when you talked about more recently that people are starting to see the traditional Indigenous governments, that's what we were doing in 1990. This is what we're trying to say. And what the narrative was taken, it's like, oh, there's a division. And the government's like, well, until you speak with one voice, we don't know who to talk to. So listen, come on in, do your investments here, because while the Mohawks are arguing amongst themselves, we can develop. So this has been used against us, and it's like that knife digging into us. And as an Indigenous woman, I'm going to talk about gender now. It's even more difficult because you're not taken seriously. It's like, okay, where's the chief? Where did he go? There has to be a man somewhere around here that will validate your voice, because you're an emotional woman, right? Women are emotional, and we know that, you can't think clearly when you're emotional. Rather than, like, I'm freaking pissed off that this is still going on. I'm freaking pissed off that as an artist, I have to focus on this because people in our community are so apathetic that they think it's up to the band council to work on their rights, instead of, as a citizen of this world, we have a constitution that predates European arrival. And like any citizen who has a constitution, you are supposed to uphold those values and not sit on your hands for your rights. You are supposed to be an active participant and know what you're actually fighting for. This is the kind of things that I find that it can't, like as Sandy said, it's so superficial. It doesn't dig into those issues of colonization and how it impacts us and how it's affecting our health and well-being, how it affects the education system that promotes racism. against Indigenous people or people of color, and so I find it's a lot more interesting to do things like this and to work on social media. And I think that if the media doesn't catch up to us in social media, they're going to be a dinosaur and not, pretty soon, and a lot of people will be out of jobs. So that's my take on it for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And that's so true. People don't really think about how they edit these interviews and how they change the narrative. And you don't have that much power to actually tell the story how you want to see. I know, Sandy, you have a podcast. I listen to it religiously. And it's so interesting because you can really get in depth with these conversations much more than these sound bites and these short articles that really dilute the message most often. So I'm curious, Harsha, if you can share a bit about your perspective on this.
Sure. Thank you again, Sandy and Ellen, following your leads here. In terms of, how to keep, like the question around how to keep momentum going for movements. And I think for me, that's the kind of main part, right? Like for movements, because as more and more people kind of get on board and get energized and become aware of issues, I think really the one significant challenge is how to make sure people stay involved, right? It's like, how do you make sure that folks who are energized or angry are on the streets, are in this for the long haul? And that's that's something, of course, that we've been dealing. That's a question that's not new to 2020, right? That's something that movements have been grappling with for so long. And part of it is that certainly movements ebb and flow. So we will certainly lose people, but we don't lose overall momentum because, as I think Sandy and Ellen both said, once you learn something, you can't unlearn it. So even if you're not involved in the same way, our collective consciousness, our collective cultural shift has happened, as minuscule as it is, right? Even if it's one step forward, two steps back, or two steps forward, one step back, whatever iteration it takes, there is a cultural shift that happens. So that's always there. But of course, the kind of movement challenge is how to keep folks involved. And that's the kind of more nitty gritty, the activism that no one likes to cover that Sandy was referencing, the meetings, those conversations around building long-term power. And how to leverage that power in ways that it's effective, right? And so, I don't want to suggest there's like a prescription to it. There's a lot out there that people can read, and it's really context specific. It's specific to movements. It's specific to geography. It's specific to the kind of, community and governance that one is part of. But I think that is kind of a challenge that we all face, and how to do that. I think another one is certainly how not to be co-opted. And I think that's a fine line, right? Because we definitely want and need this work to expand into every sector. We need everyone to be taking this on. We need allies everywhere. We need politicians everywhere. We need NGOs, service providers, everybody to be doing this, but also to have them doing it in a way that doesn't co-opt the movement, right? So that there's a distance and a separation that is healthy, and to not have demands especially be determined by other groups, right? Particularly NGOs or political parties. They shouldn't be the ones setting the agenda for movements. It should kind of be the other way around. Like, here's the demands. Are you on board or not? And I think that's another piece, is making sure that we're not being co-opted, while ensuring that as many people as possible are made aware of and have the opportunity to get on board. I think it's also really important. This is specific, perhaps because I'm on the West Coast, which is like NGO central. Every NGO on the planet, particularly climate NGOs, are out here. And I think it's really important for people, and just echoing, what Ellen and Sandy are saying, it's important for us to speak in a way that everybody understands, that people don't feel that they have to have a job in an NGO in order to be involved in the movement, that you don't have to, we need demands, but you don't have to feel that you're like a specialist who's trained as a lawyer. And I work in a legal organization right now, and it's like, I don't want people to, we have skill sets that we can offer as a legal organization, but we're not the people who can and should determine the needs of the people, right? We can just offer support. But it's so important that we don't get trapped into the idea that only experts and, specialists are the ones who can provide support to movements. And I think that's really important in the kind of broader critique of the nonprofit industrial complex is to understand the roles, like what's useful that the NPIC can provide, right? Without having people feel disempowered by that. And, something that Sandy said made me think of, so one of the things that was mentioned in the bio was Red Women Rising. And so Red Women Rising, for context, is just this beautiful, report's not really the word, but it's a publication that came about in the context of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And in the heart of Vancouver's downtown east side, which is, one of many ground zeros for Indigenous women, for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and trans and two-spirit people, particularly since, a very long time, especially in the 80s, and then the Picton Farm in the 90s and 2000s, and everything since, and everything in between, and everything before. And of course, the downtown east side is also home to the annual Women's Memorial March that started in 1992 to honor and remember missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and trans and two-spirit people. And so women in that community, particularly Indigenous elders, are not new to, of course, the issue of gendered colonial violence, and are also not new to governments either first ignoring it or then pretending to get on board, right? There was a provincial inquiry, the Uppal inquiry, before there was a national inquiry. The VPD apologized even before that during the trial on the farm. And so there's this history of like, oh yes, like mea culpa, but what are you going to do about it, right? You can say it, but what are you going to do about it? Which of course fits into this broader, reconciliation industry, right? You can say it, but what are you going to do? But very specific to that issue, connected to much more, of course. And so Red Women Rising, just listening to Sandy speak about the systemic racism, but not going deeper, and Ellen talking about the same, was really, 125 women in the downtown east side, 110 of whom were Indigenous women and girls, or Indigenous women, not girls, and then others of whom were kin or family members of women who were missing or murdered, participate in this process of Red Women Rising to say, we're going to tell our story because we want it known. And also we want very specific things. We have very specific recommendations for what the government needs to do beyond just saying, we're sorry, we'll do better. And that report has 235 recommendations, which I know comes on top of many other ones, but also 30 key recommendations, which have actually been, in terms of movement, have been really effective, right? Because when the report came out, the city of Vancouver just wanted to talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women, but without making commitments to what they were going to do. And women who participated in this process said, we actually don't want to hear what you have to say. And I'm thinking here, I have a memory of Sophie Morasti, who passed away recently. Sophie Morasti was one of the leads, kind of facilitators of this project and process. And I remember her in a BC Housing meeting, and everyone was there. BC Housing, BC Housing is a massive social housing body in BC, and they're crying and they're saying, we care so much. And she straight up said, I don't want to fucking hear a word. She straight said, I don't want to hear a fucking word out of you. I want to know yes or no if you are going to do these 5 things. That is all I want to know. I'm here, people can do their learning on their own time. You are government officials getting paid. I'm not here to do anything except find out if you're going to do these 5 things. And it was brilliant, right? Because of course, we all need to be learning and educating, but government needs to be held accountable in a very different, explicit way. And so, I share that hearing Sandy, and really in memory of Sophie and so many others who really paved the way for me to think about, how do we do this work in a way that's expansive, where we don't only reduce ourselves to demands in ways that can get co-opted, but also are very clear about what is it that we want, so that we're not so vague that they can get away with saying, oh yeah, of course, yes, because now they know the language, they know reconciliation, they know systemic racism, they know austerity, they talk about economic crisis, they can say all the things without committing to anything. So how do we make sure that we're doing both? In a way, and also that we're asking for things, here drawing on the legacy of the Black Panther Party, calling for reforms pending revolution, right? So not shying away from reforms, but doing the ones that are in the spirit of revolution, on the path to revolution. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Sort of segue. Ellen, I know you mentioned earlier that the media wouldn't cover really in the 1990s with the Ghanaian people were sort of like your demands. They sort of shift the narrative out. I don't know if you people in the audience are aware, but recently a journalist of the Dish with One Mic was arrested and charged for mischief when he was reporting on land reclamation in the 1492 land back. Uh, and so, what do you think are the impacts of police arresting these journalists who are actually trying to do the good work and trying to report what's happening on the ground, but they're being just arrested and sort of shut down? So if you can share your thoughts on that, and I'm sure all of you guys could.
Well, it's part of the big colonial machine, right? To silence the voices that show the truth. And in 1990, they tried to silence the journalists, especially when the Canadian Army moved right into the community. They banned all of the reporting, and so I think that it's part of the movement. It's a slower movement than, say, south of the border, of this authoritarianism that is peeking its head once again in a democracy, whereby the Indigenous people are still a pain in the ass to society. We're still protesting. We're still saying that, listen, we are being discriminated against. You're not telling the truth about the history. I'm glad, Harsha, you mentioned the bureaucrats who know darn well, the strategy of trying to silence the voices of Indigenous people and the coercion that happens within our communities, right? So this is like part of the decay of what people think is a democracy, and I think the journalists, if they're allowed to do that, then what will other journalists also? At what peril are other journalists who are trying to expose the truth about certain stories? What will they suffer? They're coming down heavy-handed right now on Indigenous communities more than anything, trying to discredit us, trying to delegitimize our voices. And so when people see that in the community, they're less likely to speak up, and they're less likely to say things. So you need the fierce people at the front lines, and the fierceness that I'm not going to be silenced. And they do all kinds of things in our communities, like as Sandy said, there's stuff that happens behind the scenes that sometimes it's even more ridiculous than a movie, because you have your own people who have co-opted, and they're pushing the people who are trying to expose the truth. The journalist is just the tip of the iceberg, and the very tip that we see of silencing the voices of the people of the land. And the people of the land are trying to speak out and say, we got the people who are concerned about climate change. We got the people who are concerned about the environment. They still don't quite get what we're talking about, but you're there. And so we need to sort of, I don't see why the Canadian Journalists Association is condemning this. I don't see why Amnesty International. I don't know if maybe I've missed that part of the news. But there should be outrage, because it sets a dangerous precedent for the freedom of speech in a democratic society. It sets a precedent for other Indigenous journalists who are also trying to expose what they know are realities in our communities. These are people who have lived that reality of colonialism, and they're trying to use that part of their knowledge to bring out the voices of the truth. And I think it's scary. I think it's really scary. They use rubber bullets on the people. They should be banning rubber bullets. They should be banning them altogether. I think that what we're seeing is a regression of this champion of human rights on the world stage, which Canada is slowly becoming, or if maybe we're just realizing it, but they're becoming something of what we see in, say, with Russia, maybe not the extreme, but how much are people willing to tolerate? And is it because he's Indigenous that he, as a journalist, is seen as not really a complete journalist because he's Indigenous and he's reporting about something that he has experience and background and lived reality for? So I think it's outrageous, and I think Prime Minister Trudeau should say something. He should intervene because he can do that, but he chooses not to. So I guess it's what we choose to accept and what we choose not to, and I think it's for us as Indigenous people, it's not new. This is not new for us, and we hope that people will see that should not be accepted.
Thank you for sharing that. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts, Harsha, on if you can just share a bit, what do you think about journalists being shut down like that? And you can share some of your thoughts on this topic.
Sure. I mean, I think Ellen already captured it, which is, it's completely inexcusable, even from the kind of, colonial court perspective. The Supreme Court of Canada really takes seriously the charter, freedom of press. That's like, an entrenched charter right within colonial law. And, when Justin Brake was arrested, and he was a reporter for APTN, he's a non-Indigenous reporter, and he was arrested in Mi'kma'ki when the fracking protests were happening, which included land defenders and settler allies in Mi'kma'ki. And when he was arrested, the courts then found, amongst other things, that, of course, freedom of the press is enshrined in the legal system, but it's especially important for reporters. Like, the court made a point of emphasizing that this is even more important in the context of Indigenous land disputes, what they called disputes, but really Indigenous land reclamation, precisely because of two things. And the court pointed to, the supposed commitment to reconciliation and the fact that Indigenous news stories are either underrepresented or misrepresented in Canadian mainstream. So the courts pointed, even within that system, to the necessity of ensuring rigorous protection for journalists, right? And the idea of, freedom of the press is such a universal, internationally understood thing, right? Like, if journalists don't have the freedom to tell stories, then how do we access anything? And so I think it's precisely as Ellen pointed, it's the fact that it's a land defense struggle, even more so that it's Indigenous journalists. And I think the other thing that we're starting to see play out is this question, which went earlier to something, Ellen, you were talking about, right? Even about social media and who's seen as traditional or real media and who's considered a journalist. So, podcasters being present at land defense, are they going to be considered journalists or not? I mean, I think 100% they are. But this idea and really the kind of gatekeeping, and Sandy can probably speak to this better, but the gatekeeping of who's considered media and who's not, who's considered an opinion or who's considered a side project by traditional media is, deeply elitist and racist and gendered and all of those things. And so I think all of these factors play out into whether that's considered the repression of a journalist, but it absolutely is. And we saw also the same thing happen in Wet'suwet'en recently, right? So in Wet'suwet'en, a number of journalists were arrested, were threatened with arrest. Another Indigenous journalist was one of the people who was actually detained for a long period of time at gunpoint, Jerome Turner, who I believe is Gitsan. And so, we see that, and other journalists were told what they couldn't photograph. They were told by police that they couldn't photograph equipment, which is again, just goes against the basic standards of journalism, being, told what you can and can't report. And so I do think that, there's this, that in some ways it's not surprising, but also we shouldn't just kind of not be surprised and therefore not make a bigger deal about it. Because I do think, as Ellen said, it's a marker of something that's same but different, right? It's an escalation that really speaks to so much more. That's a tip of the iceberg. And, really it's perhaps a rhetorical question, but, if journalists can't speak freely, given that that's their entire mandate, then who will be able to, right? In that kind of way, who will be taken seriously, who will be given a platform. And so I think it really is quite serious, and particularly so when that repression is happening in the context of movement struggles, right? Of decolonization, of land defense. that makes it that much more important that we get access to that.
Yeah, for sure. Sandy, I'm curious about in the BLM movement, if there's a form that you've seen, that you've witnessed, or that you've heard about journalists being shut down.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think there's a way that, especially in Canadian media, the assumption is that you can only be um, objective as a journalist if you are white. And so, a lot of over the last summer, with the uprisings that have happened, we saw a lot of Black journalists kind of sidelined in discussing these issues, even though they are the ones who have the knowledge to be able to discuss this issue with the type of um, uh, importance, respect that these issues deserve. And I think that the state pays quite a lot of attention to that and knows that they can get away with, for example, arresting Indigenous activists, or sorry, Indigenous journalists, and claiming that they're just activists because they're like, oh, we'll just paint them all with the same brush over here. And I don't think we would not see it on every single front page if it was like Rosie Barton who was arrested, but because Courtney Sky, who is one of the hosts of the Red Road podcast, was arrested at 1492 Landback Lane while covering the issue. Oh, she's Indigenous, so not an issue that the whiteness of Canadian media is even interested in discussing. It should be an outrage among Canadian media. Everyone should be talking about it. I mean, we also see media repression in other ways. We in Toronto, there was an action that happened where statues were painted pink, and what a low risk. No one gets harmed. Everything was cleaned up the next day. Action in Hamilton, there was a similar situation where folks uh, painted Black Lives Matter on the road. It's been happening in cities across North America that activists have been doing these things. In both of these cases, people were instantly criminalized because the state knows, pays attention, and knows they can instantly criminalize these people, and they don't care about the impact that will have on our democracy because they don't see us as enfranchised, as fully enfranchised in the same way as other white folks in this society. And so what ends up happening is people were arrested for throwing paint on a statue that, students play that a prank every year doing the same thing. But all of a sudden, you do that while saying Black Lives Matter, and people are detained and arrested and now have records as a result. People in Hamilton were basically just terrorized. Like, the police started following certain Black activists around the city and were saying that everybody was going to be under investigation, and they would do the investigation for as long as they wanted, and arrests could happen at any time. They were really trying to put a chill on this organizing, and this is in a place where 51% of Canadians have now said that they're in favor of some sort of defunding the police because of the Black Lives Matter movement. The government has done nothing, zero, has not moved on those things. And I can't imagine another issue where you have over 140 protests in over 70 cities across Canada, and the government's just like, nothing to see over here, and they're using the state police apparatus to criminalize us. Like, that is outrageous to me. Is there any better proof of why we need these types of movements in our society? And finally, I'll just say that we're seeing that type of repression all over North America as well. I mean, Portland, taking a look at what's happened in Portland with a lot of journalists who are Black and other people of color, but also just white journalists as well, being attacked by the police because they just don't want people to see these uprisings. And it's, I think, I really agree with Ellen. Like this should be front page news everywhere. Like this is it's a grand attack on democracy. But I truly think that because it's people who aren't respected as fully full citizens, full participants in a democracy, that people just, or the media, a white supremacist media, can turn away from something so heinous. It really, really is disturbing, but also illuminating. And that's how people should really view it. Like this should really open your eyes to the way that, if you could treat journalists this way, how are they actually treating the activists? And then just other people, just broadly, your average person in society who is Black, who is Indigenous, who is another person of color.
Yeah, I think it's really refreshing that at least now we can have the technology and like social media exists, and we can hear those stories from the activists themselves, and we can actually, like, I heard this story that you were referring about the painting, the pink painting in your podcast, and that's how I heard about it. So it's really interesting that we have to go to other ways to inform, but we're like getting people there, which is, yeah, but worrisome. So over the last few months, the phrase defund the police, which once reserved backrooms of most radical political thoughts, have been entered the mainstream discourse and emboldening emergency in the social justice movement. Yet there's still like this, there's still like these three conversations going, and where you talk about abolishing, defunding, and then there's people who are still talking about reform. And I just wanted to see if Sandy, you can like talk about a bit the difference between the three of them. And you can,
Yeah, sure. I mean, one, I don't think there's any difference between defund and abolition personally. I don't. I think, for many interviews, the first question that the interviewer will ask when they want to talk to me about defunding the police is, well, do you want to defund the police or do you want to abolish the police? And that is actually a proxy question for, are you a reasonable person or are you an unreasonable person? That's what they're asking. So you come to the table to talk about how the police are harming your communities. And the very first question that they want to ask you is, wait, should I even listen to you? Are you one of the Black people that are reasonable, or are you one of the Black people who are not reasonable? And I think that is a really disgusting way to approach a conversation. The very first question, the thing that should be on everybody's mind is, well, gosh, like, how do we stop this from happening? That should be the first question, not are you a reasonable person? But going down, framing the question, the issue that way seems ridiculous to me. Why wouldn't we frame the issue as, what is it that the police do well that we can keep? If you really want to think about it that way, then let's think about it that way. What is it that the police do well? I really haven't had anybody able to respond in a way to say anything that makes sense. And that's why, defund is the same as abolition to me, because it's just taking the funds. It's just saying exactly what we want, which is taking the funds out of the police and putting it into things that actually do create safety and security in our society. Like, I've had some interviewers say, well, the police do, they respond to allegations of sexual assault. I'm like, do they? Do they? They really don't. Not in our society. Less than 10% of sexual assaults are reported to police. They're not doing that. And then maybe they'll say, well, what about like theft and when things are stolen? They only lay a charge in 15% of cases. And that doesn't mean that they've solved the case. It means they've laid a charge. They don't even do that. Okay. Your insurance company is more helpful to you when you experience some sort of theft than police are. And so, like, wild idea. Why don't we, instead of criminalizing people and putting all of this money into this service that doesn't work, make sure that people have access to proper housing, that people have access to food, that people have access to things that they need, so they don't have to resort to other options in order to fund a life that our society doesn't set up for all of us to thrive and live properly. Take this money out of this really terrible service that doesn't do what we think it all does because of years of propaganda showed to us on television. They don't do those things. And in fact, what they do is they target, constrain, restrain, and interrupt the lives of Indigenous and Black people. And that was what they were created to do. What a wonder that they're continuing to do such a thing. Why are we trying to reform something that is not reformable? There's been decades of attempts at reform tried. Nothing works because policing works exactly as it was initially intended to work. It was intended to harm Black and Indigenous communities. Why would we want to save an institution like that? That's a waste of time. Let's create institutions that actually do what we need in society, that actually provide the security and safety that our families, that our communities so desperately need and that we all deserve. That is maybe a harder thing to do than just throwing stuff at the police. But let me tell you, gosh, like we could build so much beauty in our society if we were able to take care of one another. And we're just wasting so much billions of dollars on the police. Why? Why would we do that?
Yeah, for sure. I think people don't even realize the amount of the budgets that they have and the crazy amount of resources that they get and how they are militarized. Ellen, if you could talk a bit about that in comparison to the RCMP in terms of that colonialism history and like how the RCMP has been used and for so long since the very beginning to repress and and really intimidate even now Indigenous people.
Well, yeah, I mean, the genocidal policy of Indian residential schools was implemented by the RCMP. They stole children from their parents' arms. They left whole communities without children. That's what the RCMP did. I mean, I love what Sandy just said. She just explained it so clearly. The police are doing what they intended to do, which is carry out the dirty work of politicians who create policies and programs and laws designed to continue to oppress Black, Indigenous people of color and to promote the economic growth and corruption, like industries like the oil industry, the gas industry, which we all use, right? We're all guilty of that. But for us, in Ganasadaga, you had these blue bloods, these aristocrats from France that had the money to, and our people used to call them the bullies, and that's exactly what we see. They're bullies. And for today in 2020, I mean, the SQ are kind of like, okay, yeah, we don't see anything criminal going on, so let's just sort of, we're just going to talk to you and go on, because they've learned that it's really the politicians who are pushing the police, who are the ones who give the funding to the police. It's the politicians. It's not the people that say we need to have more funding for the police because X, Y, and Z, because Shell or Suncor or some company is breaking the law, is violating the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. That's what the police has been used for against us. They're not social workers. They're not nurses. They're not doctors. And they're expected to do all these things where, it goes against what they're supposedly designed for, which is the safety of the public, which means, but why is the public afraid of them? Like, why when they come into our area where we live, or if we're walking on the street, talk to us, are we afraid? We automatically feel guilty. We're trained to feel shame when we see them coming towards us, and that's not right. If you're going to create something that is supposed to be for the safety of the people, educate, like what the Royal Commission or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission said, educate the judges, educate the lawyers, educate the police, talk about the real history. And if we had all the same values, it's like, what kind of values do we have in this society? What are the values? And it's like, it's a question I think people really need to ask. What is the most important thing? And if you think about survival, it's to have food, shelter, and I would say that this is a necessity, is love and compassion and the courage to continue every day to be practicing those things, so that peace is a priority. So how do we get that peace? It's not through brutality, and it's not through imposing, somebody who has like an 8-month program to be a police, to say, okay, go do a health check on someone who has a mental illness, as they did. When they killed that Indigenous woman in, I think it was Nova Scotia somewhere. And there's so many that it's like, why are police doing health checks? I mean, where is the social worker? Where's the person who is trained to help people with mental illnesses survive to the next day? Where are they to help carry them? And in society, we have such a big taboo around mental illness. We don't realize that our own prejudices are there to say, okay, oh, well, the police were doing their job. This person with a mental illness came at them with a knife. Well, was there not another way to help them besides shooting bullets into their body? And I think this is something that, Sandy hit the nail on the head, which is the government is seeing all this happen, but they're not doing anything. It's like the murdered and missing Indigenous women, the National Plan of Action, how to make Indigenous women feel safer in society. Like for over a decade, if not 15 years, Canada's been told, come up with a National Plan of Action. And they're kind of like, oh, let's see what other reports. Oh, like we'll put a person who thinks she's a feminist as the Minister of Indigenous Relations. Let's just paint it like all rosy pink, and say we're very concerned with the amount of violence against Indigenous women. We're really concerned, and it's like this woman that you mentioned, Harsha. Like, well, what the fuck are you going to do about it? Because it's not just up to us. We're trying to do something. What are you doing about the laws and policies that push Indigenous women into those vulnerable situations where the perspective of society is we're disposable because we're Indigenous, because we take your land, you don't do anything about it, so you're not really you don't matter all that much. You're not a citizen that votes. You're not a citizen that actually pays taxes, which is another fallacy. So you don't matter. You're on the bottom, and so when we talk about defund the police, we should be bringing all those issues into the discussion instead of saying it's a black and white issue and that this is right and this is wrong. There's a lot of gray in between, and I think it's irresponsible for the Prime Minister and anybody else who's a politician who has the ability to make positive changes to stay silent. They need to speak up, and they need to put their money where their mouth is. So that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. Especially with the ongoing process, and you see sort of like these politicians sort of comments or trying to be like, yeah, Black Lives Matter, but in reality, what are you actually doing? I want concrete results. Is really interesting. And Harsha, what about you and your movement? I know for the migrant rights, the police plays a big part of these whole "you're the man." So if you can speak a little bit about that and how impactful would it be to actually defund the police for migrant rights?
Yeah, I think that's where think you defund as part of abolition, similar to abolition, and also I think when we're thinking about defund and abolition specifically, I think it's thinking about the abolition of all kind of carceral institutions, right? Policing as a force and policing as an institution and a way of state surveillance and state discipline. And so when you mention, for migrant rights, certainly CBSA, Canada Border Services Agency, needs to be abolished, right? And, most people don't even know that prior to 2006, CBSA wasn't even armed. And prior to 2003, CBSA didn't even exist, which isn't to say immigration enforcement didn't exist. Of course, it existed and has existed, as part of kind of white supremacy state structure and the idea of controlling movement. But the kinds of ways in which we've entrenched policing policing is so old, and on the same time, it's new in terms of human history, right? Like in terms of how long humans have existed on this planet, it's relatively new, and particularly in its current formations. And so it's important for us to just be able to open up our imagination to ways of creating safety that aren't policing based, right? So it's so important for us to think about that, and also realizing that policing in so many rural communities is not a reality. There are entire towns in, at least in northern BC, where police don't exist, where people have to figure out ways to keep each other safe. And here I think of the ways in which Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about abolition as presence, right? And Sandy, you were saying this too, how much harder it would be to actually think about this. In some ways we can all say, yes, we'll all be safer without the police. 100% we will be safer. And how do we create that safety at the same time? That's hard work on all of us. And some of us have those structures figured out. In other instances, we have so much work to do. But I think, that's the vision and the promise and the possibility of abolition, amongst other things, is the police and all carceral institutions. And I think it's so important for us to keep those other carceral institutions in mind, because when we say defund from the police and reallocate to kind of care-based services, which we absolutely need, we also have to ensure that those care-based services aren't reinventing those same kind of carceral mentalities, right? We know social workers, for example, when it comes to child apprehension, they're a completely colonial, anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, anti-migrant, anti-all of those things kind of state institution, right? I have not worked personally with any Indigenous woman who has not dealt with child services and who does not think that they are just as bad as the police. And in fact, social workers do often work with the police, right? You get a knock on the door, it's a social worker and a cop. Social worker as cop or social worker with cop. And that's also true, of course, with healthcare, right? When we want more healthcare providers, we also want healthcare that's not carceral healthcare, that's not punitive or racist healthcare. We want genuine healthcare. Same for education. And so I think what abolition helps us do is think about all these institutions, particularly police, but policing as a system, and the ways in which it runs through so many institutions, right? That police and prisons are tip of the iceberg, and we have so many institutions that enforce discipline and surveillance and violence and exploitation and incarceration on people. Another form of a carceral institution is the temporary foreign worker program, right? People are literally held in worker camps. You're often told that you can't leave. You're told when your curfew is. There's a bus that takes you in some farms for 1 hour of a week, right? And this isn't to say it's like prison, but it's to say that it's a carceral regime where it's built around the idea of control. And of course, it's no coincidence, right, that these are predominantly Black and brown migrant workers from the Caribbean, from Mexico, from Central America. In the case of domestic workers, and not just in Canada, but around the world, like the kafala system in the Gulf states, in the Arab Gulf states, you literally have migrant workers who talk about migrant worker programs as modern day slavery, right? As modern day enslavement of particularly African women in the Arab Gulf states. And so we have to see the ways in which these kinds of kind of carceral institutions are playing out in so many ways, and not in ways that really kind of conflate or make or flatten across differences, but that really show us the ways in which they're reproducing that. And then, the last thing that I would say about that in terms of defunding the police is also just how much we need to change about laws. Like, police create crime, right? Like, wherever you have a beat enforcement team, they suddenly decide that you have committed crime. They decide that you have jaywalked. If there's not a cop in a certain neighborhood, they won't see that it happened. In other neighborhoods, you loitered, you jaywalked, you did whatever. And we have laws that are actively criminalizing, right? Like sex work laws, drug laws. We're in the middle of another health crisis. We're in the middle of an opioid crisis where we have more deaths than the pandemic. And yet we have drug laws that completely criminalize, amongst other things, simple drug possession. And so, those are all part of it, is also fundamentally changing what's even considered crime, right? Like, most crime is not crime. It's the state deciding that they've constructed crime in a certain way to criminalize poverty, and, to criminalize, amongst other things, poverty. And so I think those are all part of what we can hold together when we're thinking about defund and abolition. And, again, reform is, as Sandy and Ellen have already said, reform is really off the table, right? These are irredeemable institutions. There's not another review that's needed, nor more money thrown into stuff like body-worn cameras or diversity training or all that kind of stuff. That just increases the scope and the scale of policing rather than shrinking it, right? That's what's so powerful about defund, is it's so clear that there is nothing that can or should happen other than completely shrinking and getting rid of the scale and the scope of policing.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's very interesting. And another question that we had for you guys tonight was, what should activists, organizers, and communities know when they're dealing with police? So if you could give people tips of how to really deal when in those situations. Sandy, if you can start.
I mean, I'm not sure if you're referring to like an activist context, like when someone's doing a demonstration, in which I have like really only one piece of advice, which is don't engage. Don't talk to the police. Don't touch the police. Don't go anywhere near the police. If you're organizing a thing, make sure that you designate someone to be a police liaison who has done it before and knows what they're doing, preferably a white dude, because they respond to white dudes better than other folks. But I mean, otherwise, quite simply, do not interact with the police. It could be very dangerous for you as an activist. And as one thing about police coming out of not just this summer, but just their history of interactions with the public, they don't mind lying to make you look bad. So try not to put yourself in that sort of situation if you're an activist, and as much as possible, avoid talking to and interacting with the police. They are not trying to keep you safe.
Thank you for that. Ellen, in your experience, because I know you deal with, it's very different in your community. What is it like when you're dealing with these types of authorities? And do you have any tips for any other nations who are dealing with these types of interactions with the RCMP and such?
Well, we don't deal with the RCMP. There's like a battle of jurisdictions between the RCMP and the SQ. So we deal with the SQ, and I think they have evolved to be more polite, to be more respectful because of the history of our relationship in this area. I think it's really safe to say, and I echo what Sandy said, never see them alone. I've had calls that say, well, we just want to talk to you. Can you come down to the station? It's like, no, I'm not going down to the station. I'm sorry. Why don't you come to this public location? I'll be with somebody, and you can ask me all the questions that you like. I think to be aware that there's possibly recordings, that there is, to be aware of their leading questions as well. It's, I live in a community that is not safe from within. It's not safe from within, let alone the racism that we're experiencing and all the other crap that we're dealing with development. Inside, it's not really safe. So people feel very mixed. But I think it's really good advice to say, always be sure of your surroundings, always be aware of your surroundings, Never let them come close enough so that they can grab you. Be honest, be safe. Every situation will be different. There's no pamphlet that says this is what you got to do if the police come up to you. It's always going to be different, and just be aware of that. Just gauge the situation. If you can not be alone, then do that. But if it's a protest, for sure, that's a different situation altogether. If you're in a protest and the police are arriving, you do need that liaison, as Sandy said. And I seem to get chosen more often than most people, simply because they already know my name, even though I don't know theirs. But it's I don't know. It's a tricky question, but I just feel like use your instinct and keeping yourself safe, and just be aware that the situation is very fluid and could change at any moment. But if you know something's coming, call a friend, short of having a crystal ball. So I don't know if that's very helpful, but that's all I can say.
Thank you. Harsha, for you, I feel like in the migrant rights movement, it's not even just the police of like being fear of getting arrested, but also deportation comes into place, especially if you're like, so if you can speak a little bit about that, of like the realities are slightly different for the migrant rights movement.
Sure. And yeah, I mean, it's similar in the sense of, people knowing their quote unquote rights when dealing with CBSA or dealing with police. And, we know that legal rights are completely on paper. They're never true. And that's not what actually happens. And that said, it's important for people to at least know that. So you have like a starting point where you can, feel safe asserting that, or having someone there. For people without status, that's particularly important, because a lot of times, whether it's police or CBSA or immigration enforcement or any law enforcement officer, they'll often ask for immigration status, but you actually have the right to refuse. I mean, again, it's a whole nother thing whether you feel safe refusing that information. But technically, you do have the right to refuse it, which in scenarios when you are with other people, that does make it a little easier to kind of assert that you don't have to provide that information. But I think in terms of, there's a lot in terms of people's rights, but as Ellen said, it's really contextual. There's no like do it exactly this way, because you really have to gauge what's safe in a particular moment, not just like paper rights. But really, I think a big thing in terms of like organizing around and against police and law enforcement, whatever. I don't like they enforce crappy laws. It's such a shitty name. But I think it's really just important to realize that, this impacts oppressed communities, but really everybody has a role to play in mobilizing and organizing, right? So for example, police might be in your schools. How can you, if you're a union member, how can you ensure that your labor movement kicks cops unions out of the labor movement? Cop unions should not be in the labor movement. Even aside from policing, they're so regressive. They never vote in favor of working class people's interests. If you've got cops in your schools, or if you're at a service provider, make sure that you as a service provider are not a service provider who collaborates with, either police or immigration enforcement. So if you're a shelter or a mental health service or a youth service or a drop-in, that you don't share or collaborate information about individuals, their immigration status, or, if you happen to know about their record or their age, anything at all, even their name, right? You don't disclose those kinds of things to law enforcement. So having those kinds of internal conversations is so important to mobilizing. Also a lot of communities, particularly, I'll say immigrant communities of color, there's a lot of like festivals where police are invited, right? Because that's like the thing that, they give those kinds of festivals legitimacy. These can be like Independence Day parades, whatever, right? So I just know in the context of the Punjabi community, there'll often be kind of multicultural Punjabi events, and cops will be there. And oftentimes it's also cops who are Sikh or Punjabi, right? Because they're seen as the role models for youth in the community. So it's like, train career day or whatever. And so to disrupt those and disrupt that for CBSA officers. So in terms of, knowing your rights, a lot of that also plays out in the context of organizing, right? When you're organizing with other people and you're shutting them down, the kinds of ways in which you'll have to assert yourself will perhaps look different than, a protest or something like that. But I do just want to emphasize that work is so important, because when we're talking about defunding or abolition of police, and we're talking about getting rid of state violence in all its forms, is realizing the ways in which it is part of our lives in all of these forms, right? So no matter where we're located, we have something that we can do to contribute to this movement and really getting rid of state violence. None of us, we're all complicit in such different ways. We're not all complicit in the same way. And people with privilege are way more complicit. And we all have a role to play based on where we're located. And so to figure out what that role is, how we can be responsible to it, how we can contribute, is just that much more important than the kind of individual things that we think that we can do. Is what can we organize and do alongside other people?
Yeah, that's very, very, very true. In terms of in COVID, how do you guys see organizing sort of evolving in this time of in pandemic? Do you think it will remain as effective as pre-COVID, or do you see any promising new forms of mobilizing emerging that were not seen before? Like, do you feel like we now, because of the pandemic and those challenges, we need to be a little bit more creative than what we usually sort of speak to? And if Harsha, you can start, and then we can.
Sure. Also, can I ask, was that the last question, or is this the last question? I have to go soon.
Almost this, and then I have a last question.
Okay, sorry, I thought you said that was the last one. That's why I was left with organizing. I think in terms of creative in COVID, I think there's obviously, just the restrictions that we need to keep in mind in terms of how to organize safely, how to do organizing differently, in light of the fact that we can't be together in the same ways. I think, in those ways, we also have a lot to learn, because there's so many communities that have already been thinking through how to do organizing. The disability justice movement, for example, has been thinking about how to organize without being always, in the presence on the streets. And so to also learn lessons from movements that have thought through how do we build stronger movements when there's certain things that we're not able to do in the physical presence in the same ways that require us to gather. I think, social media is increasingly, and Ellen and Sandy pointed to this already, is such an important tool. And so how to also do social media in a way that doesn't become everything, right? Because we can't hashtag our way to to the revolution itself. And also, how do we use it? How do we utilize it effectively? So to have it, be a tactic, but not like a means to an end or the only thing that we're doing. I think there's a lot more, partly because the pandemic's, it's hard to see our way through this haze, to be honest, right now for me. But I think those are some of the most salient pieces, and really just how to mobilize people, right? As we said earlier, there's a lot of people who are interested and who are enraged and who are angry, and who are disgusted and who want to do things. And so how do we do that in the context of, those are already challenging questions of how to ensure that folks are involved, and then how to do that in the context of a pandemic is, even more challenging when we're not able to be together in the same ways.
And Ellen, if you can speak a little bit about that.
I'll be brief, because then we need to go soon. I think the issues are not going to go away. We still have those issues to try and deal with, and demonstrations are a good way. We did a rolling blockade for July 11th, 1990, and Ganawaga's done rolling blockades for the Wet'suwet'en on the Mercier Bridge. When you inconvenience people, it makes news. Unfortunately, but it's how do we stay safe? I'm not of the belief that this is a hoax. I think it's real. There's people who are getting ill, and so we need to try and stay safe while keeping the issues and trying to make that positive change that we need to in today's society. It's going to be a challenge, but I think the bottom line is to stay safe. So, thanks.
And Sandy, what about you?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a challenge certainly. But I mean, you know, so is the never-ending pandemic of anti-blackness. It's just, how we choose uh to inconvenience people, because really, as Ellen said, that's the thing that makes people move. And so I think there's differing levels of risk that people can take. And so, where I'm located right now, there is a rally every Wednesday that I attend where masks are given out and people are careful to not be too close together. And, we're in front of the Justice Building of Los Angeles, and we're there every Wednesday. Um, and there's other types of actions that happen. The scholar strike that happened this week, where a lot of scholar faculty students did not attend class and instead created teach-ins and did a lot of education work for people, which I think was also quite useful. And then there's things that we're doing just simply online in terms of BLM. We've organized emergency grants to go out to our community because our government is clearly not doing enough to make sure that people have what they need to survive during COVID. All of this is, different levels of action that can be taken. The most important thing I think that activists need to remember is that when you are organizing online, you just got to make sure to do it safely. There are some applications that are more secure than others. And you have to remember that a lot of the companies that make these applications will use them and give them to the police if the police ask for them. And so just do your research and make sure that you're using secure applications, and being careful while you're online, just as you would when you're out on the streets.
Perfect, thank you. So the last question for tonight's panel is, you know, we talk a little bit today about all these movements, uh, but if you can share like this final note of what do you think it's so important of linking them, and what are the links? Because sometimes when they talk about climate justice, migrant justice, indigenous rights, all of these, and Black Lives Matter, all of these movements are very linked together, but a lot of people and mainstream don't necessarily see it. So if you guys could illuminate a bit the links and really final remarks. Sandy, if you can go first.
I think that we have a little bit discussed the linkages between our movements. I think that certainly the three of us sitting on this call can talk about how policing and the police in our communities um, all really target our communities in ways that they don't target people who aren't Indigenous, people who aren't migrants, people who aren't Black. And so the way that the state cracks down on particular communities and tries to keep us at the margins through the use of policing. I mean, that's a thorough line through all of our movements. And so, this is a topic that really, is central to the Black Lives Matter message, but it impacts so many different communities that it's really just a human issue. It's just an issue in our society that needs to be tackled. It's of particular urgency for particular communities, Black communities, Indigenous communities, communities who are experiencing targeting for incarceration in varying ways, people who experience mental health issues and so on. Like there's just so many people who are particularly impacted by this. But I think that through our answers today, we've shown how these issues are really interconnected, because the state really has a few apparatuses that they use in a carceral way to control assault, and policing is certainly one of them.
Mm-hmm. Harsha, if you can explain a bit and expand a little bit on the links between them.
Sure. I guess since this is actually our last question, I just want to express my gratitude to you all for organizing at Concordia, and really just my deep appreciation and respect and admiration for Sandy and Ellen for the work you do, and for being able to share space here and to be just in your presence and to learn from all of you, and both of you in particular. And I think really, as you know, Sandy and Ellen have already said that, you know, or Sandy has said, and Ellen and Sandy have made clear through all of our talks, is these links kind of come out through all of the questions already, in the context of, you know, COVID. And COVID, we're seeing, you know, how does COVID exacerbate all of this? Is it really both illuminates and exacerbates the existing inequalities and systemic patterns of injustice, right? So we see who's most impacted by COVID around the world are the very communities that we're talking about: Indigenous communities, Black communities, refugee communities who have the border closed on them, you know, homeless people, sex workers. All of these communities are most impacted by COVID, because COVID has brought to light what already exists, right? And the thing that COVID also tells us is that we can't keep anyone safe unless we keep all of us safe. Like, this virus, you know, travels in such a way that we realize, I hope, our shared humanity. Like, you know, we're so indoctrinated in us and them, and then there's like a virus that will impact all of us very differently because of existing inequality, but has the capacity to travel in ways where we're all impacted, right? And so, you know, I think that's really something that COVID is animating. And, you know, climate is similar. You know, I'm sitting here on the West Coast, there's like wildfire smoke. The air quality in Vancouver right now is one of the worst air qualities in the world this weekend. Anywhere in the world is in Vancouver, perhaps other places on the West Coast too. And, you know, we know that the climate crisis is not like a pending apocalypse. It's so real for so many communities. There are so many communities who are on the front line of the climate crisis. There are entire islands that are being submerged in the Pacific Ocean, right? Like, we don't have to go doomsday about it, but this is real, that people's lives are on the line. And again, you know, many of those who are the most impacted by the climate crisis are similarly, you know, are very similar in terms of who's impacted: Black communities, Indigenous communities, peasant communities, farmer communities, refugees. You know, Bangladesh is building an entire silt island to put 700,000 Rohingya refugees on, and that island they are building is on the verge of submersion. Like, it's horrific. But we see, right, that all these crises that we're in exacerbate existing systemic inequalities. And I will say, particularly the issue of migrant justice, which were, you know, like the connection to migrant justice and Black and Indigenous struggles. I think it's also important to remember that many migrants are Black and many migrants are Indigenous, that these aren't separated issues. And when we're talking about impacts by police, it's primarily and first and foremost Black migrants who are most impacted by long-term immigration detention, because they face the kind of triple, quadruple punishment of the criminal legal system, policing, and then immigration. And of course, you know, this is work that has been done by people who've highlighted this, like Robin Maynard and so many others who've highlighted the particular impacts on Black migrants. And this is also true of Indigenous migrants, right? Many Indigenous migrants who are coming to work the farms in Canada are from Guerrero, are from Oaxaca in Mexico, right? They're Indigenous communities. And so it's important that that when we're thinking about the migrant, that we also hold within it the reality of those who are Indigenous and those who are Black within migrant struggles. But really, just thank you so much for everyone's time. And really thank you again, Ashley, for moderating, and Sandy and Ellen, to both of you.
Thank you very much. And Ellen, maybe you can share your last thoughts.
Yeah, I want to thank Sandy and Harsha for educating me, and I think it's just been an exciting discussion. And Ashley, for your very compassionate and respectful manner of asking us these questions and pulling the knowledge out of us. I think what you know, like in human rights, we say all rights are interdependent, interrelated. One right that is violated prevents you from enjoying all of your rights. And for Indigenous people, our rights are based on the health and the rights of the environment, Mother Earth. And what we're seeing, what we've been talking about, is exactly that. This virus, whereby nature finds a way. We can try and suppress things, and if we're not respectful of it, it will find a way. And so this is the thing that we need to understand as a species, that we are not, bulletproof. And we're not, if we don't start teaching the politicians who are the leaders and who make the decisions that those two are connected, then this society is not going to last. This is going to be, the Earth is how many billions of years old. She doesn't need us. She doesn't need us as a species to continue destroying her health. But I think it's really important that people continue to keep those networks strong in spite of a pandemic. We need to respect each other's spaces, and we need to really push for that change, whether it's through a petition, whether it's through pressuring your member of parliament or the mayor of your local riding. Climate change is happening. Food sovereignty is going to be a really big issue, and we're going to have to start fighting for things. That's what's going to happen. It's going to be this sort of dystopic future that I see if we don't make change now. The Hopi elder Thomas Panyanka told the UN, we've warned you so much about trying to stop abusing the earth. Now it's time to help to get your people to prepare for the changes. And the changes that we see coming are things that we can influence. We are able to be part of that, to influence that change. And as long as we feel powerless because the police are doing the dirty work of the politicians, the longer we stay silent, the worse it's going to get. So everybody needs to get off their chairs, get off social media, start talking to people, and just be part of humanity and be part of the environment, because we are part of it. We're not separate from it. It's a precious thing to have life, and we just need to respect it and value it. So I guess that's all I can say for now. But thank you all. It's been a great honor and a pleasure to be part of this exciting discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I just would like to thank all of you guys for participating. Amazing woman, incredible and very inspiring. So we're very, very honored and excited to have you all here tonight and sharing your knowledge and educating and trying to, again, in our university and our space, dismantling this types of oppression and these types of systems that we really need to be discussing much more. So I would like to just wrap it up, guys. Thank you very much for viewing us tonight. Thank you for CSU, ASFA, Cooper, Disorientation, and Sustainable Co-Coordinator for organizing this panel tonight. And I hope everybody had enjoyed the panel, and have a great night.